In this video, we want to look at early modern tragedy after taking a look at the histories in the previous video. And already there I tried to show how these genres aren't very neatly distinguished, and that there's quite a lot of overlap. Generally speaking, one of the main structural differences between histories and tragedies is that the protagonist of the histories is shown much more in his interdependence on social structures, so how the character is embedded into social structures and how the character is also determined, influenced, and influences social structures, whereas the tragic hero becomes the exclusive focus of the play. And that is often shown in an isolation, in a social isolation of the character. We usually find that as the tragedy progresses, the main characters become much more isolated. I've also talked about the precursors to the early modern drama, and to repeat what I've said in that video, if the mystery plays are being secularized into the histories, then we can say that the morality plays are being interiorized into tragedy. So these ethical questions, these moral questions that the morality plays post on usually in a religious framework are now being interiorized into the motivation and the decisions of the characters. When we look, for example, at a play like Marlowe's Dr. Faustus, the protagonist actually still encounters good and bad angels. You see them here sort of in a screenshot, and they actually appear as characters on stage, giving him advice. And the seven deadly sins make an appearance, so these are still remnants of these personifications from the morality plays. And in this, as I said, in the histories is secularized into the counselors. You usually have sort of a good counselor and a bad counselor, and the king being sort of torn between these. And we can imagine that sort of the next step is to have sort of the good and the bad angel sitting on the shoulders of the protagonist. But that already tells us that they're really not there, but rather figments of his imagination. And then once you sort of go all the way, then it's really just about the inner world of the character and what they think and what brings them to a certain decision. And we do not only recognize remnants of these personifications in the good angels and the bad angels, but also, for examples, in characters like the vice figure. So there's always kind of the enemy figure, the arch enemy standing for evil in these morality plays, where it's all very clear cut. And in early tragedies, we find characters who sort of fulfill that structural role. I already gave you that quote from Richard III, where he says, "I am determined to prove a villain." So I'm going to be the bad guy, and it's not something that I'm led into gradually or that I develop, but rather this is sort of my what I am. And in a later scene, he actually comments on that and says, "Thus, like the formal vice, like the formal character vice, iniquity, I moralize two meanings in one word." So I fulfill that role of the vice character on this stage. So these are ways that the early modern tragedy connects to the immediate precursors of medieval theater performances, the mystery plays and the morality plays. But obviously, of course, the Renaissance tragedy also revives classical Greek and Roman tragedy. In that's part of its humanist agenda, its rediscovery of the ancient authors, and therefore harkens back to these classical models of tragedy, and creates its own fusion, fusing the Elizabethan drama and the storyline complexities that we see in the histories with these tragic stories and with generally more morbid endings, in which the protagonist usually dies, compared to Greek tragedy, where the protagonist often lives. So there is a lot more death at the end of Elizabethan tragedy. And at the center of the tragedy, at the center of histories, there is a historic fact, and that is something that is being investigated, negotiated. At the center of tragedy lies what we might call the tragic fact, but that is, of course, something we need to talk about. What is tragic? What does that mean? Where does that come from? Now we can, again, look back at one of the important source materials for Shakespearean tragedy, for example, Giovanni Boccaccio's De Casibus Virorum Illustrum, so something that comes out of the earliest Italian Renaissance, basically a story collection of people's history. And we can see there already that there are basically three main reasons for tragic developments, for developments from good to bad, someone having something bad happen to them. The first of them is what we might call the fall of an innocent person. So someone hasn't done anything bad, but something terrible happens to that person. And the idea behind that is, of course, that there is fate, and fate is something we can't control. And bad things will just happen to you because of that. This is sort of the shit happens version of how the universe works, although, of course, the contemporaries would have referred to it rather as the Wheel of Fortune, or Fortuna, which is the goddess of chance. So here in this medieval illustration, you see here these people who are bound to that Wheel of Fortune, and that basically means sometimes you're up, but also sometimes you're down, and you are bound to that. So it's not your agency. You can't do anything against that. So whether you have done anything wrong or not, luck or bad luck will rain upon you. Then, of course, there is the more Christian idea that when something bad happens to you, that's basically a deserved punishment for sin. So it's just an expression of a higher form of justice. So you have done actually something wrong, and the punishment, whatever happens to you, is commensurate with that wrongness. Both of those cases, when we look into Aristotle's theory of tragedies, he kind of pushes them aside. And that's not really tragic, because the first thing is just terrible. It just tells us that the universe is basically meaningless, and bad things can happen to anyone. So that doesn't give us anything. Whereas we're probably cheering on the punishment for a sinner, but that also doesn't afflict us in the same way that tragedy should. So the third version of or possibility for the tragic to emerge is rather to look at the relation between mistakes, individual mistakes, and the consequences of these. So this isn't about someone who is perfectly good and something terrible just happens out of chance, but it's also not someone who is the vice, right? Who's the bad guy, but rather who does have who makes a mistake out of what is then often called a tragic flaw. So not a perfect character, not a perfectly bad character, but just a human being with flaws. And this tragic flaw, or hamartia in the Greek, is kind of the starting point. But then the consequences is what we see develop throughout the play. And then if these consequences really start to become really bad, that's when we start to feel for these characters, because in a way they're just like us. I mean, we know we're not perfectly good, we know we're not perfectly bad, but we are in a way like these characters who just make mistakes and then have to live with the consequences of these. One thing we can observe when we look at the development of early modern tragedy is the changing relative emphasis on these different causes. Now, the purely Christian interpretation, they remain largely with the morality plays. This is something that we have gone beyond, but in the earliest versions of these tragedies, fate and fortune are still playing quite a large role. But as writers develop the form, they are gradually replaced by causes that lie much more within the individual characters. We can see this already in the history plays, when we look at the development from a play like Henry VI to Richard II, which is very much about, or much more about what goes on in the character and not in the external circumstances. But we can also see it in the development from a play like Romeo and Juliet, where it's still very much implied already in the beginning. This is from the prologue, that these are star-crossed lovers. Right? This is sort of has become a theme, the star-crossed lovers. And the idea is, of course, that it's in the stars that their love isn't meant to be. And that's not something that they can work against. And in fact, if you look at the play itself, it's the fact that it ends as a tragedy and not as a comedy or with a happy ending is really chance. They have this crazy plan in the end, how to get away with it all, and it could have worked if not for one letter that was postponed because of social restrictions after in times of plague. So very, very fitting for our time here. But it's a pure chance event that makes the plan impossible, and then they all die. Spoiler alert. Whereas if we take a later play, Othello, with a similar theme, it's also about love. And this one is about jealousy. And in this case, there's also sort of this famous chance element that Othello finds the handkerchief. But when we read the play, it's very clear that he would have reacted the way that he did, even without the handkerchief. The handkerchief isn't this this all-important element anymore, because really it's the character of Othello, the character of Desdemona and the others that determines what they're doing. So we see this de-emphasis on of fate and chance in the plays. But what of course remains throughout all of these configurations between individual will and chance is that the tragic hero constantly feels torn between individual responsibility and being bound by divine providence. So their own agency, their own ability to do something and to make choices, and the feeling that they are bound by forces that are beyond them. Now, of course, that's a philosophical contradiction. You're either free to do whatever you want, or you are bound by things that are external to you, and that contradiction fundamentally remains unresolved. That is the point that I try to sketch in these introductory videos, where we have left the Middle Ages, where the focus would be entirely on being bound by larger providence, but we are not yet at a place where we said I'm completely free and there is nothing above me and there's nothing that binds me socially or theologically. So it remains unresolved, but of course that's the reason why it provides such rich material for dramatic conflicts, and conflicts that remain interesting to engage with, because the centuries after that have given different answers, but the question has remained interesting, and you can sort of take up the questions that the early modern stage poses and give your own answers, but the questions remain relevant. That's one of the reasons why the play has, or these plays have remained so relevant. And here's the quote. Sorry, that came a little bit late in here, but you can read it at least once more. Of course, tragedy was thought to serve a moral purpose, and by showing human mistakes and their consequences, tragedies are supposed to teach us how to behave better. And there were two main types of tragic mistakes that man can make. The first is hubris, where man tries to be or to achieve more than is granted to him. This is the figure of the Overreacher. And the other is the so-called slaves of passion, where man is ruled by his passions and therefore loses his rationality. To start with the Overreacher, it's another of those ambivalent examples of what we might call the transitional nature of early modern society, transitional between a medieval frame of mind and a modern frame of mind. It still retains this medieval idea of a clearly structured and hierarchical cosmos or society. So this is this idea of the great chain of being. This was a medieval understanding of how the universe is sort of structured. It's all a chain of being, a hierarchical chain that leads from the lowest form all the way to the highest forms, and the highest form, which is of course God. There's also there's a different depiction of this, which is called the ladder of intellect, where you can see that there's sort of this consecutive step that starts from inert mass like stone, through flame, plant, beast, human, and then angels and God at the top. So so this is the idea, and the idea is of course that God puts everything at the exact spot where it belongs. So any wish to change one's position or any act that changes one's position is clearly seen as a sin. And everyone is supposed to be where they are, which is of course something that less and less reflects reality. I tried to show earlier how, for example, education became a factor in changing one's social position. You could actually gain power, political power and social standing through education, and that was something that challenged this idea of a very, very stable socially constructed society. So it also becomes increasingly questioned if it's not really reflecting reality anymore. And the Overreacher, who is that character who doesn't want to accept that there is this sort of boundary between humans and higher beings, and wants to overstep that and become something more than human, is therefore, of course, a tragic hero in the full sense of the word. He necessarily can only end tragically. This has to end in tears because it goes against God's order, but he is seen as a hero nevertheless. He's the way that he's depicted, and it is usually a he on the early modern stage. The way that he is depicted is with heroic qualities, with admirable qualities. And that works partly with identification and sympathy, and that has a lot to do with the way that these characters are being presented, and has a lot to do with the fact that we are getting much more insight into their interiority, into their minds. And the closer we get to someone's thinking, the more we are able to maybe not identify, but at least empathize with that person. And also, of course, there's the fact of rhetoric, of these characters being rhetorically very skilled in order to persuade us of their own ideas and what they are. The playwright that is most closely associated with this form of tragic character, the Overreacher, would be Christopher Marlowe, who develops this type in different versions. One of the versions is, of course, Dr. Faustus in this play, The Tragical History of the Life and Death of Dr. Faustus, based on a medieval legend. So Faustus is someone who, in Marlowe's version, thirsts for infinite knowledge. He wants to know more than is given to man to know. And that, of course, is a very early modern thing to say, okay, now we want to start science. Now I want to know how the world works. And of course, needs to be punished for that, but also stands for the scientific revolution, stands for these changes in attitudes towards science. Another character that goes for infinite power would be Tamburlaine. Tamburlaine the Great, and again we see this is in many respects a terrible character, and certainly a problematic and sinful character, and again needs to fall. But it's also a great character. It's also a character that awes us with his ambition, even though we know we're not supposed to cheer him on. So very, very nicely showing us the ambiguities of these characters. And even where we do not feel that the Overreacher is glorified, we are often made to feel complicit with his inner struggles and his inner humanity. Macbeth would be one of those cases. Now, Macbeth also oversteps the bounds by wanting to become king, and of course oversteps boundaries of moralities in a very clear way. So he's never given to us for us to admire him, but yet we can't help but feel for him because we're so close to him, and because we get isolated with him. As in the end, of course, Macbeth is completely cut off from everyone else. He has either killed off or sent away everyone who he could rely on, and we are with him in these moments, and that of course brings us closer to this character. Now, while the Overreacher tries to become more than man in the chain of being, so tries to get closer to the image of God, the slaves of passion become less than man. They become, in a way, animalistic by being ruled by their passion, because passions are something that is not rational. Passion is something that connects us sort of to this lower sphere of existence. So by giving into their passion, they become less than human beings should be. But of course, this as well moves. So this is, I mean, to say, okay, if you give in to your passions, you become beast-like, and that's a sin. But again, if we look at the way that these characters are depicted, we see that we are moving far away from a clear and unambiguous condemnation of passions that we still could find in the morality plays, where indeed passions are personified and externalized, and they actually appear on stage. But here we have much more sympathy again with these passions, and we see ourselves maybe much more in these passionate characters, and the clear condemnation that we are supposed to feel. Remember, this is sort of the early modern framework. We're supposed to feel a negative condemnation of these passions, and that becomes more difficult. We can see this, for example, in characters like Falstaff, who I mentioned already, who at the beginning is sort of really just this comic relief character. This guy likes to eat, is a coward, shies away from conflict, and really is basically there to lead the prince astray. So he's one of those characters who tempt the main person away from their moral purpose. But as Shakespeare comes back to that character, he starts to there's more sympathy for the characters, and there's more insight into the character, and he becomes more complex, and therefore not as easily condemnable as that. But of course, the most well-known example of these slaves of passion would be Romeo and Juliet, which we are used to consider as the ideal lovers. But this very idea is really an inheritance of Romanticism that has immortalized this idea of absolute love, and that there's nothing higher than love. But this worldly love, of course, for an early modern audience, there would be something higher, and that is the love of God. So to give into that kind of passion with the intensity that Romeo and Juliet do is actually, when we harken back to a medieval frame of morality is a sin. It lowers you below the rationality of human beings. But then, of course, if we look at the play, it's very obvious that they are not easily condemnable, and that they're actually that Shakespeare uses all of his abilities as a writer to make us like them and to make us admire their love and to marvel at the beauty of their love. We can here, for example, look at the scene where they meet for the first time, and that is the way that Shakespeare renders that is immediately full of not only passion but poetical beauty, because as we will see, the first thing that Romeo does is he uses a poetic metaphor in comparing Juliet to a shrine and himself to a pilgrim. And he says, if I profane with my unworthiest hands this holy shrine, the gentle fine is this, my lips, two blushing pilgrims, ready stand to smooth that rough touch with a tender kiss. And Juliet immediately enters into that poetical game, and she goes on to work with that metaphor. And he says, well, good pilgrim, you do wrong your hand too much, which mannerly devotion shows in this. For saints have hands that pilgrims' hands do touch, and palm to palm is holy palmer's kiss. So no, not the lips, but just the hands. And then Romeo says, well, have not saints lips and holy palmers too? And she says, aye, pilgrim, lips that they must use in prayer. So she reminds him of that. This is a sort of blasphemous subject that you're getting into here. And then he says, oh then, dear saint, let lips do what hands do. They pray, grant thou, lest faith turn to despair. And Juliet says, well, saints do not move. And obviously, in the image, the saints do not move because they're statues that are being adored by the pilgrims. But she also says, well, I won't move. If you make a move, I won't go back. So saints do not move, though grand, for prayer's sake. And then Romeo says, well, then do not move, then move not, while my prayer's effect I take. And then, of course, he kisses her for the first time. And that's very nice, and it's very poetical. But even more so if we recognize that this full first exchange from the first words being spoken to the first kiss is exactly 14 lines long. And whenever you see something that is 14 lines, you should immediately think sonnet. And yes, it is. It is a perfect Petrarchan sonnet that Shakespeare has sort of just smuggled into the ongoing text of the play. So we see how much effort he puts into making these admirable, or into sort of emphasizing the beauty of their love. And that's the ambivalence, that we are supposed to condemn them, but we won't, and that makes them interesting. So what we can detect is a large conflict between the norms on the one side and our sympathies with the characters on the others, which is also, of course, an expression that many of those norms are under question and are being challenged in a way. And we can see this in the way that many of these feelings, these character traits that we would now very clearly rate as positive, originally were something negative, like ambition, passion, curiosity, honor. All of these are, for us, positive terms, but in an early modern framework, much more conflicted. But they are not no longer simply condemned as in Christian morality. So by focusing on the human, they are seen as driving forces of man's development. And the main technical device to make us closer to the characters, to focus on the interior life, is of course the monologue. That's one of the reasons why the monologue takes such a center stage of attention also when we're looking at the plays, because that's the point where we are invited into the characters' minds, really. It becomes a medium of self-representation. What do I want to be? What do I want to appear as? Remember this idea of Renaissance self-fashioning, turning yourself into something. But it's also, of course, an explanation of motives, of feelings, and thoughts. And interestingly, again, we can look at the development of the tragedy, and we see that the monologue changes throughout the development of early modern drama. At the beginning, it's very much a piece of formal rhetoric. It's basically like a speech that has been prepared and that is given to an audience. So comes from this humanistic tradition of teaching and learning rhetoric. But as playwrights sort of work with that device, it becomes more of an internalized and more of a spontaneous expression. So what the audience experiences isn't so much a ready-made, ready-formed thought that is just given expression, but rather what they're seeing is thoughts and choices as they are being made. Because that process of deliberation, that process of thinking about things is turned into language. So we see exclamations, we see changes in opinion, we see broken syntax, even broken meter. And this development that can be traced from dramatists like Kidd to Marlowe and then Shakespeare, but also even within the development of Shakespeare. So obviously the most well-known example of this would be the To Be or Not to Be monologue. I will not go into sort of a detailed reading of the monologue, partly because this video is already running too long. But I definitely want to point to the fact that that what we can see here is Hamlet really grappling with the thought, and the thought here is suicide. Should I kill myself? Is that a good option at this point? And at one point he compares it to sleep and to dream, and then we have here this where he says, to die, to sleep, perchance to dream. There's the rub. For in that sleep of death, what dreams may come. So at this point, he says, yeah, okay, but. So we see how he is not finished with his thoughts, but we are actually going along with these thoughts as he's having them. And to end this survey of early modern tragedy, I want to look at one of the most popular forms of tragedy, that is the revenge tragedy. And this takes one of those specific norms and problematizes it. And the norm is, or the question here is, who is allowed to take revenge? Is it God, which is mine is revenge, says the Lord? That's in the Bible. Is it the state? Is that a prerogative of the state, or is it the individual who is actually allowed or even asked to enact revenge? Now, obviously, individual revenge is problematized. It's stigmatized historically in the Wars of the Roses, which basically were a series of revenge and counter-revenge that ever escalated. But it's also condemned theologically. But this clashes with the individual cases that are depicted in these tragedies. Thomas Kidd's The Spanish Tragedy is usually seen as the starting point for this. And in this play, the state cannot take revenge for political reasons because it is implicated in the crime. So you can't go to the king in order to get justice because the king himself is involved in this. And then Kidd's model is taken up in more than 24 plays that we know of. The most important of which, of course, is Shakespeare's Hamlet, in which many of the aspects of Kidd's play are taken up, but also complicated. Whereas Kidd's play is more about the technicalities of revenge, how to best enact our revenge. For Hamlet, the call for revenge is really the reason to question his own identity. And through this, he becomes one of the core examples and role models for a modern consciousness, maybe together with Faustus. And then later on, as this tradition goes on, in Jacobean theater, this is turned even more towards the violent side of it, towards sort of a splatter aspect, if you will. Cyril Turner's The Revenger's Tragedy from 1606 is sort of a high point in that, but already Titus Andronicus was pretty drastic in its level of violence that it had. So in this play, Elarbus is burnt alive and has his arms chopped off. Titus stabs his own son to death. Basanius is murdered and thrown into a pit. Lavinia is brutally raped and has her hands cut off and her tongue cut out. Martius and Quintus are decapitated. A nurse and a midwife are stabbed to death by Aaron. An innocent clown is executed for no apparent reason. Titus kills Chiron and Demetrius and then cooks them in a pie, which he then feeds to their mother. And then in a final scene, in a space of just a few lines, Titus kills in succession Lavinia and Tamora, is then immediately killed by Saturninus, who is in turn immediately killed by Lucius. Aaron is then burned up to his neck and left to starve to death in the open air, and Tamora's body is thrown to the wild beast outsides of the cities. So the play has 14 killings, 9 of them are on stage, 6 severed members, 1 rape or 2 or 3, depending on how you count, 1 live burial, 1 case of insanity, and 1 case of cannibalism, an average of 5.2 atrocities per act, or 1 for every 97 lines.